Hello and welcome to another episode of Canadian History X. Today we're in the community of Froude, which is named for an English historian from the early 19th century. Now Froude during its time actually had 200 residents living here, and as you can see the church in the background, that was actually built in 1921, and it stood until 1974 when a fire erupted in the attic, more or less completely destroying the church, so they rebuilt it. And they did this even though the community was down to only a couple residents after the school and the post office had both closed in the late 1960s and early 1970s. They held their big anniversary dinner for this church in 1981 when about 125 people showed up. Right now there's not much left of Froude except for this church, a couple of other buildings, and an old bell. And it's located right near Weyburn. It's very easy to get to. It's on not a through road, but it's an easy enough drive to get towards. So let's find out what was about Froude all those years ago, why the people left, and what is there now. Froude is a name that is mispronounced a lot, and mostly forgotten to the history of Saskatchewan. While it at one time had over 200 people living in it, those days are long gone, and now all that remains is a few old buildings and a church that has seen better days. Established in 1908 because of the railroad, as with most places in the prairies, it was originally named for the English historian James Anthony Froude, and before long the community quickly began to spring up in southeast Saskatchewan, about 40 kilometers away from Weyburn. The first and only bank to appear in Froude was owned by the Weyburn Security Company and was brought into the community in 1920. Originally a store owned by Comba, the company bought the location and remodeled it as a bank with H.R. Almquist running it as the manager. In 1922, the bank became a sub-branch of the Griffin Bank and was only open 3 days a week. 1 year later, in 1923, the bank closed for good and was moved out of the community. Boy Scouts, found in many communities in Saskatchewan, were also found in Froude. In 1912, a troop of Boy Scouts were formed in the community with Hill Hamilton as a scoutmaster. The organization would go in fits and starts over the years before it officially ended in the mid-1920s. Jack Yateman was actually awarded the Bronze Medal for saving the life of his patrol leader. The medal is the highest award given in the Boy Scouts. A telephone was a link to the outside world for many communities, and Froude was unique among Saskatchewan villages in the fact that it had 2 telephone companies organized. It was originally planned to have only one telephone company, but with the area being quite large, the Department of Telephones decided to create the Froude Rural Telephone Company and the West Froude Rural Telephone Company in 1913. Mac McKee was tasked by the RM Council with petitioning residents to see if they'd be interested in having telephones. The lines were built in 1914 and maintained by a series of repairmen. From the 1940s to 1950s, Walter Barnes would drive around in his Model T fixing the lines. In 1969, after 56 years of operation, the company came to an end as SaskTel took over. A few years after the community was created, it was nearly destroyed when a tornado ripped through in 1916. The tornado destroyed several barns in the area and smashed the Froude rink completely, resulting in the need to have it rebuilt. On the topic of the rink, it would once again be blown down in 1918, and the community would be without a rink until 1938, when the men came together to make a one-sheet curling rink. Lumber was provided from a building torn down on the Wolseley farm. Eventually, the rink had 2 sheets of ice, and in 1948 things were going strong. In the 1950s, the rink continued to operate until it closed before the end of the decade. School was something that was desperately needed in the Froude area from the earliest years. The Froude School Division was implemented in 1907, and in 1908 it was decided to build a school. Poole Construction was hired to build the school, and material was hauled from Stoughton for its construction. In June of 1908, the school was completed and included a cloakroom and measured 28 feet by 40 feet. Ida Dix was hired as the first teacher, but since she could not arrive until August, Solon Cromwell was hired to teach for 6 weeks. The school officially opened on July 6, 1908, with several students attending. The school would serve the community until 1947-48, when a new school with 3 classrooms and a kitchen was built. Unlike in many communities that would have teachers for 1 to 3 years on average, Froude had the distinction of Nettie Broughton, serving from 1933 to 1960, totaling 27 years. At her retirement, Premier Tommy Douglas himself came to speak at her celebration dinner. The school would operate until 1969 when it closed for good. The first church to operate in Froude was found in a house built by Walter Foster in 1904, about 3 miles away from the community. With the renters being Anglicans and having a piano, it was decided to hold church services in their living room. The first baby baptized in the home would be the child of Stuart Needham. In 1910, the Hewitt family, who were the renters of the home, were presented with 2 Morris chairs and a mantel clock in appreciation of allowing their home to be used for church services. It would not be until 1921 when a church was actually built. This was done thanks to the work of the Presbyterians of the community and a loan taken out on June 8, 1921. Throughout the community, donations and pledges were also provided. A CPR shed was purchased and the lumber was used to make the church. A basement was dug by volunteers and the church was built. In 1933, the loan for the church was finally paid off, and for the next several decades, the church would be a centerpiece for the community. On August 19, 1974, a fire would erupt in the church in the attic. A great deal of the church was destroyed in the fire, and with the number of attendees already quite low, it was debated whether or not to rebuild. The decision to rebuild was approved, and the steeple was rebuilt in October of 1975. On June 20, 1976, a special service of rededication was held. In 1981, the 60th anniversary of the church was celebrated with 117 people coming out on August 13th to remember the church they loved. On September 27th of that year, the final service was held and the church stood empty. The last use of the church was in 1985 when Logan Bjarnenson was married. The post office would officially close in the community in 1968 after 60 years of operation. As with any community, hundreds of people lived there and had many memories, and these were just some of them.